the best of my ability, and I'm absolutely comfortable doing that.
Washington Journal continues.
Washington Journal viewers are familiar with Steve Moore, an economist, author, visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us now to talk about President Donald Trump's economic and tax plans, and specifically a recent report in the Hill newspaper that the Trump team is considering cutting the federal budget by about $10.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Steve Moore, you wrote about this recently for the Washington Times, and you called it a $10 trillion stimulus plan. Why?
Well, good to be with you, John, and thank you for C-SPAN. I'm a regular viewer. I was trying to be a little provocative because when the news came out, and by the way, this was a press report that the Trump administration is looking at paying for, the tax cuts and the increase in the military and the infrastructure with offsetting cuts. And one of the things Donald Trump did say on the campaign was that he not only wanted to balance the budget, but that he also wants to start retire some of this $20 trillion debt, and who could be opposed to that? The point I was making is that government spending is not a stimulus for the economy. There are a lot of economists who believe the more the government spends, the better the economy works. I have the opposite philosophy, and I think the evidence is on my side, that when you cut the government and cut the fat and the waste and the inefficiency in government, the U.S. economy actually performs better. A good historical reference to that was the late Bill Clinton years, when you had a Republican Congress and a Democrat in Congress, a Democrat in the White House, and you had some very substantial cuts in government spending, and the economy did very well during that period. So I was just making the point, if we can get this budget deficit down, if we can get the taxes and the spending down, I think it will be a very positive thing for the U.S. economy.
I want to clear up for our viewers, last time you were on the program, I believe you were an economic advisor to the Trump campaign.
Right. I worked for the campaign.
Are you still in? Do you still work at all with the Trump administration?
I have not. I have not taken a position with the new administration. I'm still getting used to calling it the Trump administration, which it's been for the last 72 hours or so. So I'm just a private citizen right now, working at the Heritage Foundation. I do talk regularly with the people who've gone into the White House. It's a great team. I'm very excited. And look, I've said I think Donald Trump has done more for the U.S. economy in his first 48 hours in office than Barack Obama did in 8 years in office. I mean, these executive orders, you were just talking about some of them, the Keystone Pipeline thing. These are very positive things for the U.S. economy. They will bring jobs. And more importantly, John, one of the things I discovered being on the campaign trail, if you go to places like Silicon Valley or here in Washington, D.C. or on Wall Street, people are doing really well. The economy's doing great. When you go to places like, York, Pennsylvania, or Rockford, Illinois, or Flint, Michigan, those places have not seen a recovery. And Trump, I think if he's going to be successful as a president and be reelected, he has to bring prosperity to all these places in the country, not just places like Silicon Valley and Wall Street.
Steve Moore with us for about the next half hour or so. If you have questions, phone lines are open. Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, Independents 202-748-8002. You can start dialing in. Going back to the Hill report, the $10 trillion cut over the next 10 years, the Hill notes that it's based largely on a Heritage Foundation budget plan that's been released. Obviously, you work at the Heritage Foundation, a visiting fellow there. What do you expect will be the key things that will be cut by the Trump administration if they go forward for this plan?
So let me say one thing about Donald Trump which is relevant to this. I think one of the things people, especially a lot of your friends in the media and so on, don't completely get about Donald Trump is he is a negotiator. His best-selling book was The Art of the Deal. When Trump puts something out there like a $10 trillion number, by the way, he hasn't done that. This was a media report, so we don't even know if it's accurate. But let's say it is. What Trump is doing is saying, this is my opening bid, $10 trillion of cuts. And he's going to go to Congress, and they're going to, Congress isn't going to probably take $10 trillion of budget cuts. But, it's a way of negotiating, and he may end up with some significant cuts in the budget. Now, what we are talking about at Heritage is eliminating scores of just spending programs that you don't need anymore. Things like the Legal Services Corporation and programs like the wool and mohair subsidies that go back to 100 years that are probably not necessary anymore. And there are hundreds of programs like that. We're talking about moving a lot of the entitlement programs and programs like transportation and healthcare, welfare programs back to the states and let the states deal with some of these problems, because you get a lot more experimentation, and you know, those states should be laboratories of democracy. We're talking about getting rid of redundancy in agencies. You know, do we really need 46 job training programs? And one other thing, there was a report that came out, John, by the federal government's own auditors about 6 months ago. As you know, it's called the GAO. And what they found was that there's about $160 billion, not 160 million, $160 billion a year in erroneous payments. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, earned income tax credit. Well, that's just fraud. That's just ripping off the taxpayer. I think Donald Trump will be very vigilant about going after the fraudulent payments and making sure that people who are getting payments are eligible for them.
You mentioned entitlements in there. Donald Trump has said on the campaign trail that he doesn't plan on touching entitlements. Can he achieve the cuts he wants to achieve, or even the bid, with an opening bid without entitlement cuts?
First
Can
of
he
all,
get there?
It's not exactly true. I mean, this has become a mythology of Donald Trump that he's not going to cut entitlements. Yeah, of course he is. I mean, what are we debating about right now? Obamacare. Obamacare is one of the biggest new entitlement programs in 40 years, and that is going to be rolled back and largely, hopefully, repealed. And we're going to put in something that makes a lot more sense, that reduces costs for patients, makes health care affordable for people, and allows you to keep your doctor, and doesn't have negative effects on the economy as Obamacare has. So it's this mythology that he's not going to cut these things. What he did say, just to be clear, he said Social Security and Medicare, which, as you know, they're the two biggest programs in the budget other than national defense. He said, we're not going to turn to those until we get this economy moving again. And I happen to agree with him on that. Number one job, I mean, the American people have been very clear on this. What they care most about right now is jobs and the economy. You get the economy moving. By the way, when you do that, you get more revenues. And then maybe, he said, down the road, we can deal with Social Security and Medicare, which have huge unfunded liabilities, no question about it.
Let's get to the calls. Michael's waiting in Georgia, in Newnan, Georgia. Line for Democrats. Michael, go ahead.
Mr. Moore, you always get on TV, you talk about tax cut this, tax cut that. Do you think tax cut is a form of entitlement to the rich?
Is it an entitlement?
Are tax cuts a form of entitlement to the rich?
Well, look, I'm in favor of reducing taxes in a very strategic ways. And by the way, John, this is really the centerpiece of Donald Trump's economic revival plan, is this tax package that he's now formulating, and I think sometime in the next 2 weeks we'll see the, how it shapes up in legislation. But the one thing I did work on with Donald Trump was that tax plan, and the main part of the tax plan is bringing our business taxes down, because we have a significant disadvantage when we're competing against, Russia, China, India, Mexico, European countries, because we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And that puts the U.S. companies at a very significant disadvantage. So our plan is to go from having the highest business tax rate in the world to one of the lowest. I think Ireland would still be lower than we are, but we'd be at 15 to 20%. I believe, sir, if we do that, it's not a tax cut for the rich, it's a tax cut for workers, because what's going to happen is a lot of these businesses that have been leaving the United States, steel companies and auto companies and technology companies, they're going to come back to the U.S. It'll be a more conducive place to do business. That's good for workers. And if you have more capital investment by American businesses, which what we need, guess what? Then not only will you have more jobs, but you'll have workers earning more money, and that's a big issue for Americans.
So the caller's concerned, though, but would that tax cut benefit the rich the most?
Well, there's two kind of components of the Trump plan. There's the business tax cut, which I just described, and that's really where a lot of the economic benefit comes from. And then Donald Trump also wants to reform the individual income tax. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this has not been reported on, because I worked with this with my buddy Larry Kudlow and the incoming Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. What Donald Trump said to us was, I don't want a tax cut for rich people. He said, I don't want a tax cut for rich people like me. I want it for the middle class. But he said, let's try to lower rates and get rid of all the loopholes and deductions and credits and all the other special interest provisions that are put in the tax code. So what we do is for people who make over $1 million, they're going to lose virtually all of their deductions. They're not going to be able to write off all of this stuff for, investing in bull sperm and windmills and all of this. And you're going to, in every dollar of reduced deduction, we're going to cut their tax rate. So they will have a lower tax rate. But overall, the amount of taxes they pay is not going to go down because they're not going to have the loopholes. For the middle class people, we anticipate that this bill, if it's enacted, will save the average middle class family watching this show about $1,500 a year.
Valley Cottage, New York is next. Peter's a Republican. Peter, you're on with Steve Moore.
Yeah, good morning. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Peter.
Good to see you. I read you in the Wall Street Journal whenever you have
Thank you.
column there. My question is about the Federal Reserve, Steve. I heard President Trump say that he wanted a stable dollar. Every book that I've read, either Schiller, Schiff, Peter Griffin, all talk about how the Federal Reserve is stealing productivity gains by working class people by creating a 2 to 3% inflation rate every year. And according to them, according to Janet Yellen and Bernanke, you need 2% inflation every year to have a healthy economy. But according to these gentlemen, that inflation rate, all it does is put people in a higher tax rate. And if they get a raise, a 2% or whatever raise every year, it gets eaten up by the federal government, and the government can pay back its debts with cheaper dollars. So could you explain that whole concept and whether it's actually a farce and it's just a way of stealing revenue from working class people? Thank you.
It's a great point. I get asked that all the time, so it's a great question. Look, I can live with 2 to 3% inflation. I'm old enough to remember when we had, 15. I don't know about you, John, but I remember the 70s when we had 15, 16% inflation. Literally, people, you'd go to the store and try to buy things before they'd mark them up again. So, 2 to 3% inflation, I think, is a reasonable estimate. By the way, that's about the growth of the economy. So I think most economists agree. But look, Donald Trump has it right. What you want in your monetary policy is a stable currency so that the dollars you have in your pocket right now will be worth what they are today, what they'll be worth with 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, that the dollar retains its value over time. I think we are going to have a new Fed chairman in, a year and a half or so when Janet Yellen's term is up. I think it will be a strong dollar person. One interesting thing that's happening is if you look at what has happened since the election, John, which was 2 months ago, the dollar has been rising. Interest rates have been rising a little bit, and the dollar has been rising. And I get a lot of people ask, well, why is that happening? And normally, a rise in interest rates would be a negative thing. But I'm going to make the case to you. I think in this instance, this rise in interest rates from the lowest rates they've been in 50 years is a positive thing. And here's why. What you're seeing is there's a rush of optimism right now. You see that in the stock market. You see that in consumer confidence, small business confidence. People want to invest again. They think good things are coming for the economy, and I happen to agree with that. If you want to invest, there's a rush of people who want to go to the bank and take out loans and so on. That's driving up interest rates because you've got more of a demand for credit. So in that instance, this demand for credit is a good thing because it means businesses are going to invest again. The same thing with interest rates rising a little bit. Interest rates are rising because people want dollars and they have to pay a little bit higher interest rate for it. But the problem we have, and this is the thing that people should think about, if those interest rates start to rise, John, who is the biggest debtor in the whole world? It's the United States government. So our borrowing costs are going to rise, and that's going to make it a little bit more difficult for Trump to deal with this deficit problem because the deficit will go up because of higher interest rates.
Let's head to Manassas, Virginia. William's waiting. Line for Independence. William, good morning.
Good morning. Your guest is kind of make me a little bit uncomfortable because Heritage Foundation, who actually architect the Obamacare, now saying that Obamacare is a disaster, and that's not right. And I think your guest should come out clean. Second, the Trump administration is saying that they're going to create jobs. I think America, wake up. He's a fraud. He has been a fraud. I think it's all about your previous caller has said it very well. I can't even articulate better than what he said. He's an absolute fraud.
All right, let's give Stephen Moore a chance
Well,
to
I
respond.
couldn't quite hear the first part of that. He said about it was something about Obamacare. I wasn't exactly
It was
sure
the
what his
history
question was.
of the Affordable Care Act
Yeah.
and whether Heritage Foundation had ever supported a program like that.
Oh, no, never. We don't want to nationalize it. We want the private sector and competition to work in healthcare, not Obamacare.
To his other point,
Yeah.
how does Donald Trump prove that to folks like that caller that he's not a fraud on these sort of issues?
Well, but let me finish this point about
Oh, sure.
Obamacare. I mean, Obamacare has been, in my opinion, a disaster in every single way. It has dramatically increased taxes. It's dramatically, every report shows it's going to blow a huge hole in the budget deficit. It has reduced employment because of this 50 worker rule that says if you hire more than 50 workers, you're going to have to pay all of these additional costs. It has not lowered costs. It's increased costs for American families. In fact, I think that's the reason Hillary Clinton in the end lost the election, was people saw these reports about 20% increase in their premiums. And, you know, John, people can't afford that. The middle class is living literally paycheck to paycheck, and they thought that Obamacare was going to save them money. And in fact, I mean, my own situation, we're paying a couple $1,000s a year more in health insurance because of Obamacare, and we need to bring those costs down. Now, about the Trump being a fraud, I will simply say that. I mean, that's such a general statement. Let's just give this guy a chance. I mean, he's been in office for 2 days. Let's see how this works. I mean, give him a shot. I think Republicans gave Obama a shot. What Obama did didn't work very well, but let's see if it works. And, you know, 6 months from now, a year from now, if his policies don't work, I'll be one of the first people out there saying, you know, we need a change in policy. But the American people clearly wanted change. It was very clear from the election. People want to change in direction. They want higher incomes. They want more jobs. And we'll see after 2 days. It's a little early to say whether these policies are going to work or not.
One of his first actions in those opening days was putting a hiring freeze on the non-military part of the
Amen to that.
federal government. I want to ask you, you mentioned the GAO earlier. This was pointed out in a Washington Post story. In 1982, the Government Accountability Office examined hiring freezes imposed by former presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and determined that hiring freezes were not an effective strategy. They have, quote, little effect on federal employment levels, the GAO said at the time, and that freezes, quote, disrupt agency operations and in some cases increase the cost to the government.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't know about that report. I'll simply say this. What you want to do, and I've done a lot of work with state governments, and they have had hiring freezes when the budgets are tight, and they've worked very well. I mean, this is what businesses do when they have tight, tough, times. They don't go out and hire more workers if they can't pay their bills. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a United States government that is running nearly $1 trillion a year deficits. We can't keep doing what we're doing right now. We have to find every opportunity to cut costs, to get rid of the waste, the duplication of government. You know, if you look at surveys, they show the average American thinks that Washington wastes about 30 cents for every dollar that government spends. Now, I think that's pretty accurate. There's a huge amount of waste in this budget, and one way to start trimming back is that through attrition. That is, when a federal government worker retires, don't replace that person and just lower the workforce that way. But look, workforce costs are only a small portion of the federal government. I think that's what this report might have been saying. What you have to do is you have to get rid of programs, and you have to, as you mentioned before, the main thing the federal government does today is send out checks to people. You know, so you're not going to reduce the cost of that by trimming the workforce.
Let's head to Jim in North Carolina. Line for Democrats. Jim, good morning.
Good morning. I'm glad you take my call, and good morning to both of you.
Hi.
This is on the taxes that why not take these money that they're saving on these programs and apply it toward the national debt and pay the national debt down. And the Obamacare did work. The private insurers, they want 35% to administer it. Medicare can administer it for 1.5% to 3%. Thank you.
Well, on the national debt issue, you know, I just want to make sure people understand the difference between our deficit and our debt, because people get confused about this. So the deficit is how much, you know, every year we spend more than we bring in, and right now that's, you know, been ranging between $500 billion and $1 trillion a year. The debt is the cumulative amount of these deficits, which is now closing in on $20 trillion. So my point is, John, before we can reduce the national debt, we have to get rid of the deficit, right? Because the problem is we're making the problem worse every year with borrowing $500 billion more per year. So I agree with this gentleman, though. I would love to see some reductions in certainly in the deficit, and eventually let's start retiring the debt. And by the way, one way we can do this, it gets back to your previous conversation, is through using American energy. I mean, I just came out with a report where we looked at, in my book, Fueling Freedom, we found that there's about $25 trillion of oil and gas and coal resources under federal lands. Well, here's a way we can reduce our debt, ladies and gentlemen. We can allow private companies to develop on non-environmentally sensitive federal lands. We can charge these companies money through royalties and things like that, and lease payments. And we can raise $2 or $3 trillion for the government, and we can use that money to retire the debt. So there are ways we can start retiring this debt, because it's just, a great nation doesn't borrow $20 trillion.
Head to Jacksonville, Florida. George is waiting. Republican. George, good morning.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Stephen, I presented a combined program of Milton Friedman and FDR to Bill Bennett years ago. The petition went through, and the Senate Finance Committee, Subcommittee on Pensions, et cetera, took it up. Hatch did the right thing, Wyden did, and Obama did not. And I'd like for you to check some numbers and start using them that are part of this whole thing. The plan is to have everybody have an IRA, which I think 31 countries have now. It started with Chile, but backed up by Social Security. So you have Milton Friedman and FDR, and you don't spend the Social Security money until or if the IRA funds drop or crash or whatever. The numbers are, I understand we're spending $2.7 trillion a year on welfare, and it's probably more than that. But I did a calculation, $40, $45 a week into an IRA, 8% gain in the markets over working life, and then you can also add 0 at 18 if it's federal money. It gives you $1 million in the bank.
Yep.
Now, I'm not sure that we're going to have enough market to cover everybody to that extent, but I'd like for you to check those two numbers, start using them. And the second one is, I worked in the oil industry, and I understand from the API, American Petroleum Institute, that we're putting about $1 trillion a year into the federal government in taxes. And then you have the multiplier effect on the gross domestic product. You take the number of barrels of oil in a particular year times the price, times, I think the number is 8, and you can comment on that. And that is the effect on the economy, the positive effect of the oil industry. Now, we do need to clean a few things up. We've cleaned a lot of things up already. But if you would take those numbers, check them out, and start using them, I'd appreciate it. And my plan, by the way, has the five parts, all in one plan, all in one fund that we're using now in IRAs, which are educational savings, healthcare savings, down payment on a house or help paying up for a house, business startup, and retirement. And I think that would fit right into what the positive things Trump is doing and what you've promoted.
George, thanks for the
Love
call.
it. Love it. I mean, I love IRAs. I love the idea of, let's let young people, let's say under the age of 30 or 35, instead of putting money into the black hole of Social Security, where young people probably aren't going to get money out, why not allow those young people to put 10% of their paycheck into like an IRA account like you're talking about, and accumulate that money over 30 or 40 years of working? And if they do that, your numbers are exactly right, sir. We estimate that the average American would then retire with well over $1 million, many people $2 or $3 million, and in that case, they could have much more money than they would get from Social Security. So I love that idea. I think it makes a lot of sense. And just one statistic on the oil and gas industry, because you talked a lot about this in your previous segment, something for people to think about who say, oh, we shouldn't use our oil and gas in this country. There are almost 10 million Americans who are employed by our oil and gas industry and coal industry. So, when people talk about shutting down American oil and gas and not building pipelines, what are we going to do, put 10 million people out of work? I don't think so. And we believe we can add 6 million new jobs in the oil and gas industry. And incidentally, those are high-paying jobs. Those are jobs that pay $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year for pipe fitters, welders, truckers, electricians, construction workers, all of the people, the steel industry. I mean, my goodness, of course we should build the Keystone Pipeline. That's 10,000 jobs for middle-class Americans who need them in a lot of these Midwestern states. The rest of the world's using oil and gas. Why shouldn't the United States?
A few minutes left with Steve Moore of the Heritage Foundation, a visiting fellow there, economist and author of 5 books now, is it?
Something like that. The latest one is called Fueling Freedom. It's about this very energy issue and how America can become the energy dominant country in the world.
Let's go to Rodney in Claremont, Florida, Democrat. Rodney, good morning.
Thanks for letting me talk. My issue is what made America great is slave labor. Slave labor was 80% of the gross product in the United States. Anytime, see, that's what we've been searching for with NAFTA. We've been searching for cheaper labor because you can't really pay a person a fair wage to make this economy to be great. And see, we sit up here and we lie to each other about certain things. When you was on point one time about the oil, you said it was $25 trillion worth of oil on certain land.
Yep.
Why should we get only $2 trillion of that money? You know what I mean? We should be getting more than half of the money on land, on our own government land. See, that to me is a product that we can get out of the ground. You know, so once you start getting product out of the ground, it's something that you can depend on. You cannot depend on running around countries with this falsehood or this cheap labor. You know, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So let me just clarify something. I'm glad this gentleman called. When I said the $2 to $3 trillion, I mean that's the taxes we can raise on that $25 trillion. Now, that $25 trillion will be a lot of that money will be going to workers in terms of pay. A lot of it will be going to the cost of actually, excavating and drilling for that oil. The production costs will be high. But you're talking about America being the energy superpower if we do that. I want this point this gentleman made about low wages in trade, I think is a really important one because people are worried about NAFTA because they think all the jobs are going to Mexico because Mexico has lower wages. But what's interesting is that the United States, if we can bring our taxes down, as Trump is talking about, and if we can reduce our regulatory costs in this country, I'll give you a statistic that I'm still amazed by. I think it'll amaze a lot of your viewers. This is according to the National Association of Manufacturers, so they're a little bit biased, I'll agree with that, but they say that the cost per manufacturing worker in America of regulation in this country is now about $17,000 or $18,000. Well, that adds significantly to the cost of hiring a worker in the United States versus, say, moving that factory to Mexico or China, where you can cut those regulatory costs in half. My point is that a lot of that movement out of the United States is not necessarily due to lower wages. I mean, it's due to the fact that it's so much less costly to do business in Mexico, China, India, Germany. And if we can reduce the cost of doing business in the United States through tax and regulatory reform, I think you're going to see a lot of these companies move back quickly. You've already seen 5 or 6 major companies saying, hey, we're going to invest in the United States now. That's a good thing for American workers.
So it's not trying to compete for wage price.
And we can't do that, right? I mean, we're a high-wage country, and it's because we're a productive country. Our American workers are as productive as anybody in the world. But the problem, I think, is more we can't go forward with the most onerous regulations, with the highest taxes in the world. And also, I think just changing the attitude in Washington. A lot of this is just animal spirits. Whether you love Barack Obama or not, let's face it, this was not a president who was particularly pro-business. Donald Trump is going to be pro-business. He's going to say, we're going to put America first. We're going to try to make American companies number one again, and it's about time.
Let's go to John in New Hampshire, Line for Independence. John, good morning.
Yes. Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. And just one thing that I just been sitting here listening to your show this morning. Most countries that have the lower taxes for businesses, as well as oil and gas, which pay no taxes as they stand today, have a value-added tax.
That's true.
In those countries.
That's true.
So that's where they make up their money.
That's true.
To compensate for the lower business taxes, thus reducing the debt. So I think it's the whole tax structure of this country is out of sync, and it needs to be reevaluated, in my opinion.
So it's a great question. It's a great point. I'm glad this gentleman called. There's a big debate going on within the Republicans right now about, I don't know if you've been following about this issue about whether we should have a border tax. And so I'm not going to make this too complicated, but in my opinion, we have the dumbest business tax system in the world, not just because we have high tax rates, but also what we do in the United States to keep this very simple. We tax what's produced here. And then when we sell it abroad, if it goes to a country like Germany or Mexico or Spain or whatever country this gentleman is right, then those countries have what's called a value-added tax. So they actually tax it, an American product, when it comes into their countries. So in a sense, what we do in the United States, we tax what we export, but we don't tax what we import. I never understood the logic of that. I mean, somebody explain why we do that. Why not tax what we import and not what we export? That way we'll have more American jobs. A lot of those factories will move back to the United States, and we won't have this disadvantage that we have in the world because we're taxing what we produce in the other country, and we don't tax anything that comes into the United States because we don't have a value-added tax. So I'm not suggesting we have a VAT, but just rethink the way we tax. And there's a big discussion about this in Washington right now. I'm not suggesting we have a VAT, but just rethink the way we tax. And there's a big discussion about this in Washington right now.
Let's go to Debbie, Marietta, Georgia, Independent. Debbie, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. One of the things that I wanted to comment on was, when we talk about bringing jobs back into the country, we need to get a better understanding of why they left in the first place. And the notion that sending jobs out of the country can help you produce products at a cheaper rate, those things benefit corporations, corporate and shareholders. They do not benefit workers. So even if what I'm concerned about now is that if we spend tax dollars to bring jobs back, that would only benefit the upper echelon, like, corporate compensation and the shareholders. But as far as the workers are concerned, even when companies have tax breaks, the workers don't see any benefit from that. There's not new hiring that everybody's expecting and everything like that. So, when you put more money into the pockets of workers, that also stimulates economy. And, the whole notion of bringing jobs back for cheaper costs doesn't affect the regular worker like it should. And the same with regulations. Regulations protect a lot of things. Sure. And what corporations would do without regulations is just, phenomenal. And I thank you for taking my call.
Well, I think there's a lot there. I think this woman makes a lot of sense in a lot of things she's saying. I'd make a couple points. I'm just of the philosophy, and I think we need to sort of adopt this as a country, that businesses are not bad, employers are not bad, getting rich is not bad. If you want good jobs and you want healthy jobs in this country, you have to have healthy businesses. It's that simple. I mean, if the businesses aren't here in the United States, then they're not creating jobs in the United States. Now, I do not favor, I want to make this emphatically clear, I do not favor bribing companies to come back in the United States. I don't favor some of the things that, Donald Trump is wielding a bit of a club right now, when he met with those auto executives, he said, if you don't produce in the United States, we're going to punish you if you try to bring things back. I'm not so sure that's the right approach. But we have to get serious, I think, in this country about how do we make American companies competitive so they can hire more workers. I mean, if you don't have those companies that are profitable and they're not expanding, you're not going to get the high-paying jobs that we want. And what I want, I don't want the rich to get richer. I'm in favor of that, but I want everybody to get richer. I want the middle class to see a pay raise for the first time in 15 years, because it has been 15 years in this country since the average middle class family has seen a meaningful pay raise in their paycheck.
Before we let you go, I want to ask you your thoughts on Congressman Mick Mulvaney, up to be Donald Trump's budget director. Your thoughts on his outlook on fiscal policy and budgeting into the future?
I'm just glad I don't have his job. That's the toughest one of all. Because, he's dealing with these enormous budget deficits. He's going to have to try to convince these people in the Trump cabinet and the people in Congress, we've got to cut this budget. We've got to start making sure that the expenditures match the receipts. That's a very difficult thing to do. Everybody in Washington loves to play Santa Claus, giving out things. Nobody likes the person who's trying to, restrain this stuff.
Is he the right man to do it?
He is. He's a very good man. He knows the budget. He's been in Congress, I think, 3 or 4 terms.
Now.
He's been an expert in fiscal policy, and we should all pray that he gets this done, because, as I said, we can't continue to borrow and borrow and borrow and think somehow that's going to make America rich.
Steve Moore is a visiting fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Always appreciate you coming by Washington Journal.
Thank you, John. Love C-SPAN.
Up next, Katrina Vanden Heuvel joins us. She's the editor and publisher of The Nation magazine. She'll be here to talk about the role of progressives in the Trump era. We'll be right back.
This weekend on